In the parched heart of Arizona Territory, 1872, the sun beat down mercilessly on Whispering Creek Ranch. Sarah Lancaster stood on her porch, squinting at the horizon where dust devils danced across her failing land. At 32, widowhood had etched fine lines around her eyes, but couldn't diminish the quiet determination that set her jaw or the natural beauty that drew unwanted attention from neighboring ranchers. 6 months had passed since Thomas's body was brought home, thrown from his horse during a thunderstorm. 6 months of struggle, of waking before dawn to mend fences, feed livestock, and fight the relentless drought that threatened to claim what little she had left. Sarah ran her fingers through her chestnut hair, now streaked with premature strands of silver. The weight of solitude pressed down on her shoulders like the Arizona heat. Nights were the hardest, the empty chair across the dinner table, the silence that had replaced Thomas's hearty laugh, the cold space beside her in bed. "You can't manage this place alone, Mrs. Lancaster," Sheriff Boone had told her just yesterday, his eyes wandering to the gold band she still wore. "A woman has no business running a ranch. Sell to Morrison before you lose everything." James Morrison. The very thought of him made her stomach turn. The wealthy cattle baron had been circling her property like a vulture, offering insulting sums while his men accidentally let their herds graze on her land. Just last week, she'd found her western fence cut, Morrison's cattle trampling what remained of her cornfield. Sarah closed her eyes, feeling the weight of isolation press down upon her shoulders. The neighboring wives avoided her, whispering that a decent woman would have returned east after Thomas's death. The men either pitied her or waited for her inevitable failure. The crunch of approaching hoofbeats made her reach for the rifle Thomas had taught her to shoot. She wasn't expecting visitors, and unexpected visitors rarely brought good news. "Mrs. Lancaster." It was Mr. Reynolds from the general store, looking uncomfortable atop his mule. "Brought your supplies." He didn't meet her eyes as he dismounted. "Thank you, Mr. Reynolds." "I appreciate the delivery." Sarah reached for her coin purse. "There's talk in town." Reynolds shifted, his gaze darting to the withered fields. "Morrison's planning to dam the creek upstream. Says it's on his property." The creek, her only water source. Without it, her crops and livestock wouldn't last a week. "He can't do that," she said, though they both knew he could. The law sided with men like Morrison, not widows with dwindling funds and no allies. Reynolds simply shrugged, accepting her coins. "Some Apache passed through yesterday, caused quite a stir. Army's looking for them, but they disappeared into the mountains." He paused. Strange times. Woman running a ranch, savages roaming free. World's changing too fast for some folks' liking. After Reynolds departed, Sarah stood motionless on her porch, watching the sun sink behind distant mesas. The last golden rays illuminated the dry creek bed that snaked through her property. Morrison wouldn't be satisfied until he drove her out. She had no family to return to in Boston, no funds for a new beginning elsewhere. This land, with its stark beauty and unforgiving nature, was all she had left of the dreams she and Thomas had shared. That night, as coyotes called to each other across the vast darkness, Sarah paced her small kitchen. The lamplight cast her shadow against the wall, a solitary figure in a house built for a family. On the table lay a letter from her sister in Massachusetts, urging her once again to come home to civilization before the wilderness claims you too. But Boston wasn't home anymore. This land was, despite its harshness, or perhaps because of it. The way the morning light painted the distant cliffs in gold and crimson, the scent of sage after rain, the vast, endless sky that made her feel both insignificant and infinite. A plan began to form in her mind, a desperate one. Dawn found Sarah riding into the foothills, where the Apache were rumored to camp. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her hands remained steady on the reins. The settlers' stories of Apache brutality warred with Thomas's insistence that most tales were exaggerated to justify the Army's campaigns. "They know this land better than any white man ever will," he'd told her once. "They respect it in ways we're only beginning to understand." The terrain grew rougher as she climbed, her mare picking its way carefully over rocky ground. Scrub brush gave way to juniper and pine, the air becoming cooler with elevation. Sarah paused to drink from her canteen, scanning the landscape. No sign of human presence, yet she couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. 2 hours into her journey, She sensed rather than saw that she was being observed. Sarah reined her horse to a stop. "I mean no harm," she called out, her voice carrying across the silence. "I'm looking for work, for someone who knows this land." Nothing moved. No sound but the wind whispering through scrub brush and the occasional cry of a distant hawk. "I can pay," she added, feeling foolish talking to empty air. "Food and shelter, too." She was about to turn back when a man appeared, as if materialized from the rocks themselves. Tall and broad-shouldered, he approached with the silent grace of a mountain lion. His black hair hung in two braids, framing a face both handsome and severe, with high cheekbones and eyes that held years beyond his apparent age. A scar ran from his temple to jaw, the only interruption in his copper skin. "You ride alone?" His English was clear, his voice deep. Not wise. Sarah straightened her spine. Necessity rarely concerns itself with wisdom. Something flickered in his eyes. Surprise, perhaps even respect. "I am Sarah Lancaster," she continued. "I own land in the valley. I need help. Someone who understands how to make things grow in this desert. Why come to Apache? Because white men want my land, not work. Because I've heard the Apache know how to harvest rain from cloudless skies and coax corn from stone." He studied her with unnerving intensity, as if reading the truth written beneath her skin. The silence stretched between them, broken only by her horse's occasional snort. Finally he spoke. "I am Bahi. It means one who walks in two worlds." He gestured to the worn cavalry jacket he wore over traditional leggings. "Fitting, no?" Sarah nodded, uncertain what to say. "Your neighbors will not like Apache on your land." "My neighbors already wish me gone. Their opinion matters little." For the first time, a ghost of a smile touched his lips. "You have courage, Sarah Lancaster, but courage alone will not make your crops grow. Will you help me?" Bahi was silent for so long that Sarah thought he'd refuse. Finally, he nodded once. "I will come. Not for your money, for the land." He looked past her, toward the valley. It was Apache land first. "It remembers us." And so began the most dangerous decision of Sarah Lancaster's life, one that would set tongues wagging throughout the territory and change her world forever. The journey back to the ranch was tense with unspoken questions. Bahi rode beside her, a silent presence both reassuring and unsettling. Occasionally she'd glance over, catching him studying the landscape with eyes that missed nothing. A hawk circling overhead, tracks left by unseen animals, the subtle changes in vegetation that spoke of hidden water sources. "Your land thirsts," he said suddenly, breaking a silence that had stretched for miles. "But water flows beneath. The old ones dug channels to find it." "Can you show me?" Sarah asked, hope flickering to life within her. Bahi nodded once. "The earth speaks. Few listen." As they crested the final ridge overlooking Whispering Creek Ranch, Sarah saw her property through new eyes, not as a failing homestead, but as land with potential, waiting for the right touch to awaken it. The afternoon sun cast long shadows across the valley as they approached the ranch house. Sarah noticed smoke rising from her chimney. Strange, since she'd left no fire burning. "Someone is there," Bahi said quietly, one hand moving to the knife at his belt. Sarah reached for her rifle. Morrison's men, perhaps. They approached cautiously, dismounting at a distance. Sarah led the way, rifle ready, Bahi moving silently behind her. Sheriff Boone sat on her porch, whittling a stick. He looked up as they approached, his expression darkening at the sight of Bahi. "Mrs. Lancaster," he said, standing slowly. "I see the rumors are true." "What rumors would those be, Sheriff?" Sarah asked, not lowering her rifle. "That you've taken leave of your senses." His gaze shifted to Bahi. "Riding into Apache territory alone, bringing one back with you." "Mr. Bahi is my new ranch hand," Sarah said firmly. "I've hired him for his knowledge of desert farming." The sheriff spat tobacco juice into the dust. "Is that what they're calling it now?" Sarah's cheeks burned with anger. "State your business, Sheriff, or leave my property." "Just delivering a message from Morrison. He's upped his offer for your land." Boone held out an envelope. "Says it's his final courtesy before taking more direct measures." "Mr. Morrison's threats don't concern me." The sheriff shrugged. "They should. Man like that doesn't take kindly to being refused." His eyes flicked to Bahi again, "Especially not in favor of savage assistance." "Thank you for the delivery," Sarah said coldly. "Good day, Sheriff." After Boone rode away, Sarah turned to find Bahi watching her with that penetrating gaze. "You understand what you've done?" he asked quietly. "By bringing me here." Sarah nodded, squaring her shoulders. "I've made a choice, to fight for what's mine. They will not forgive it. A white woman and an Apache." "I'm not looking for forgiveness," Sarah replied. "Just survival." She gestured toward the house. "There's a room off the barn you can use. It's small but dry." Bahi shook his head. "I will sleep under stars. Walls?" He made a subtle gesture, as if pushing something away. Too much like the prison camps. As darkness fell, Sarah prepared a simple meal of beans and cornbread. To her surprise, Bahi joined her at the table, his movements graceful despite his size. They ate in silence, but it wasn't uncomfortable, more contemplative, like two travelers assessing the journey ahead. Later, as she washed the dishes by lamplight, Sarah caught sight of Bahi through the window. He stood in the yard, face lifted to the star-filled sky, lips moving in what might have been prayer. Something about his solitary figure stirred an unexpected ache in her chest, recognition perhaps of a fellow soul acquainted with loss. Sarah turned away, suddenly conscious of intruding on a private moment. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new battles. But for the first time in 6 months, she faced the prospect with something beyond mere determination. Hope, fragile as a desert bloom, had taken root in the parched soil of her heart. The first light of dawn found Sarah already awake, her sleep disturbed by dreams of Thomas and worries about the decision she'd made. She moved to the window, pulling aside the faded curtain to scan the property. For a moment she feared Bahi had disappeared in the night. Then she spotted him by the eastern fence line, still as a statue, watching the sunrise paint the desert in hues of amber and gold. Would he truly stay? Or was this merely a brief respite in his journey elsewhere? Sarah couldn't blame him if he left. The danger she'd invited upon them both by bringing an Apache to her ranch was real. Yet something in his eyes yesterday, a recognition, a shared understanding of what it meant to stand alone against forces determined to break you, gave her hope. She dressed quickly and headed outside, pausing to gather eggs from the henhouse. By the time she reached the fence where she'd seen Bahi, he was gone. Disappointment flickered through her until a deep voice spoke from behind. "The soil here remembers water." Sarah turned to find Bahi examining a handful of earth, crumbling it between his fingers. Up close in the morning light, she noticed details she'd missed yesterday. The intricate beadwork on his knife sheath, the eagle feather tied into one braid, the way his eyes caught the sun, revealing flecks of amber amid the deep brown. "The creek bed's been dry for months," she replied. "Surface water, yes." He gestured toward distant hills. "But beneath," he knelt, placing his palm flat against the ground. "Water still flows. Deep, like memories beneath skin." By the 3rd week of Bahi's arrival, Sarah was certain she'd made the right choice, despite the consequences. Morrison's men rode by more frequently, watching from a distance. Sheriff Boone had paid a friendly visit to warn her about harboring an Indian, especially one rumored to have fought against the cavalry. "I'm harboring no one," she'd told him firmly. "I've hired a skilled worker who respects boundaries, unlike certain cattle barons." What she didn't tell the sheriff was how Bahi had already begun transforming her failing ranch. He'd identified underground springs that fed the creek, digging channels to redirect water to her most parched fields. He'd shown her how to plant corn, beans, and squash together, the way his people had for generations. 3 sisters, he'd explained one afternoon, his hands strong yet gentle, demonstrating how the corn provided stalks for beans to climb, while squash leaves shaded the ground to preserve moisture. They protect each other, grow stronger together than apart. The simple wisdom in his words resonated through Sarah like a bell struck in a silent room. How long had she been trying to stand alone, like a solitary stalk in the wind, when even plants understood the strength in connection? They worked from dawn till dusk, speaking little. Bahi was not a man of many words, but his silence wasn't uncomfortable. It was respectful, observant, so different from the suffocating silence that had followed Thomas's death, when neighbors brought food but avoided meeting her eyes. To Sarah's surprise, she found herself talking more than she had in months. At first, just practical matters, explaining the layout of irrigation ditches Thomas had started, discussing which fields might be salvageable first. But gradually other words emerged. Memories of her childhood in Boston, the books she still treasured, stacked beside her bed. How she'd met Thomas at a lecture on Western expansion, their whirlwind courtship scandalizing her family. Bahi listened with an intensity that made her feel truly heard. He rarely interrupted, but when he did speak, his observations cut to the heart of matters with uncanny precision. One evening, as they sat on the porch after a day of mending fences, Sarah noticed Bahe watching her with that penetrating gaze. "Why do you stay?" he asked suddenly. "Your people in town, they think a woman should not live alone, should not work the land." Sarah looked out across the property, to the distant mountains turned purple in the fading light. "This land was a promise Thomas and I made to each other, a future we planned together." She touched her wedding band. "Without him, it's still my future, just a different one than I imagined." "You grieve still?" It wasn't a question, but Sarah nodded. "Some days less than others. My people say grief is like the river. It carves its own path. Fighting it brings only pain." Something in his voice made her look at him more closely. "You've lost someone too." Bahi's gaze turned distant, focusing on something beyond the physical landscape. The silence stretched between them, not uncomfortable but weighted with unspoken stories. "My wife, my son." His voice, when it finally came, was low but steady. "Soldiers came to our village while I was hunting, 3 winters ago." The simple words carried such weight that Sarah felt tears spring to her eyes. "I'm sorry. I wanted to die too," he said quietly. "Followed the soldiers, killed 3 before they caught me." He touched the scar on his face. "They left me for dead. But the earth said, 'Not yet.' So I live." They sat in shared silence as darkness fell, the weight of their losses hovering between them like the fireflies that began to blink in the gathering darkness. No platitudes, no awkward reassurances, just the recognition of parallel wounds, still healing. That night, Sarah slept more soundly than she had in months. The next morning, Bahe was gone before sunrise. Sarah tried to ignore the hollow feeling in her chest, telling herself it was better this way. He'd helped her implement systems that might save her ranch. She should be grateful for that much. But as she went about her chores, feeding chickens, mending a tear in her work dress, pulling weeds from the newly planted garden, she found herself listening for his footsteps, glancing toward the hills where he'd first appeared. By midday, with no sign of his return, worry gnawed at her. Had the sheriff arrested him? Had he simply decided to move on? She was in the barn, mechanically brushing down her mare, when she heard footsteps. Bahi stood in the doorway, a deer slung across his shoulders, his expression as unreadable as ever. "You came back," she said, unable to keep the relief from her voice. He tilted his head slightly. "I said I would help. The work is not finished." That night they roasted venison over an open fire. Bahi showed her how to use every part of the deer, the meat for food, the hide for leather, the bones for tools. Nothing wasted, everything honored. "My people lived this way for generations," he explained, expertly cutting strips of meat to dry for later, taking only what is needed, giving thanks for each life that sustains ours. As flames cast flickering shadows across his face, highlighting his strong features, Sarah found herself studying him. In the firelight, the hardness that usually defined his expression softened. She noticed things she'd overlooked, the gentleness of his hands as he worked, the depth of compassion in his eyes when he spoke of the land, the quiet dignity with which he carried his pain. He looked up suddenly, catching her gaze. Instead of looking away, Sarah held it. "You see me," he said simply. 3 words that somehow contained multitudes, not as an Apache, not as a hired hand, not as someone to fear or pity, just as himself, a man with his own grief, his own strength, his own heart. "Yes," she whispered, "I see you." Something shifted between them that night, fragile as a seedling pushing through cracked earth, yet undeniably alive. The days took on a rhythm. They rose with the sun, worked side by side, shared simple meals and sometimes stories. Bahi spoke of his childhood, of Apache traditions, of a freedom that existed before reservation boundaries. Sarah told him of Boston, of books she'd loved, of her first terrifying months in Arizona territory. Gradually, she realized that tears no longer came every night. The crushing weight of loneliness had lifted. She caught herself laughing at Bahi's rare but insightful observations, planning for next season's crops, thinking of possibilities rather than merely survival. One morning, Sarah found a small object placed carefully beside the coffee pot, a perfectly round stone polished smooth with bands of red and amber that caught the light. She held it in her palm, feeling its warmth. "It speaks of fire beneath the earth," Bahe said, appearing in the doorway. "Of things that seem solid but can change." Sarah closed her fingers around the stone. "Thank you." Over the following days, she discovered more gifts. An intricately woven grass figure shaped like a bird. A feather with markings he explained were messages from the wind, a small pouch of fragrant herbs to help her sleep. Each gift spoke of attention, of seeing, not just her physical needs, but the emotions she thought she'd hidden so well. One afternoon, while irrigating the western field, a sudden gunshot cracked the air. Sarah's horse reared in panic, throwing her to the ground. Pain exploded in her ankle as she landed awkwardly. Before she could catch her breath, Bahi was beside her, his body positioned between her and the direction of the shot. In one fluid motion, he lifted her onto his horse and swung up behind her. "Morrison's men," he said grimly, urging the horse toward the house. "It could have been a hunter," she argued, though they both knew better. "A warning," Bahi replied. "They do not want your land to flourish." Inside the house, he gently examined her ankle, his fingers warm against her skin. Not broken, twisted. He looked up at her, so close she could see flecks of amber in his dark eyes. "You trust me to help you." Sarah nodded, unable to speak past the sudden tightness in her throat. Bahi disappeared outside, returning with plants she didn't recognize. He crushed leaves, mixed them with water, and wrapped the poultice around her ankle with a strip of clean cloth. His touch was careful, almost reverent. "Thank you," she whispered. He looked at her then, truly looked at her, with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I see your tears, Sarah Lancaster, the ones you hide from others." The unexpected words broke something open inside her. No one had noticed or cared how she struggled to maintain her composure, how she saved her grief for the darkness of night. "How?" she managed. "Your eyes speak what your lips do not." His hand hesitated, then gently, so gently, brushed a strand of hair from her face. "You are strong, but strength is not absence of pain." In that moment, with his perceptive gaze seeing straight through to her wounded heart, Sarah felt truly understood for the first time since Thomas's death, perhaps for the first time ever. Her hand moved without conscious thought, covering his where it rested against her cheek. "All this time," she said softly, "I thought if I showed weakness, I'd lose everything." "Tears are not weakness," Bahe replied. "Rain is not weakness to the earth, it is healing." Sarah closed her eyes, leaning into his touch. "I've been so alone." "Not anymore." His voice was a promise, solid as the mountains. When she opened her eyes again, Bahi was watching her with an expression that made her heart beat faster, a tenderness mixed with something deeper, more primal. "Your husband?" he said carefully. "He was a good man." "Yes," Sarah answered honestly. "He was kind, believed in this land, in me." Bahi nodded slowly. "He would not want your heart to die with him." The truth of his words resonated through her. Thomas had been full of life, of plans, of joy. He would have hated to see her existing rather than living. "No," she whispered. He wouldn't. That night, as rain pattered against the roof, the first in months, as if the sky itself approved of the seeds of renewal being planted below, Sarah dreamed not of loss but of possibility, of hands strong enough to build and gentle enough to heal, of eyes that saw beyond surface to soul. And for the first time since Thomas's death, she woke without the weight of solitude pressing down upon her chest. The next few days passed in a blur of shared work and growing awareness. Every glance, every accidental touch as they passed tools back and forth, carried new significance. They moved around each other in a dance of restraint and recognition, both acknowledging the invisible current between them, while respecting boundaries neither was quite ready to cross. But boundaries, like fences, require constant maintenance, and some forces, like water, like feeling, will always find a way through. One evening, After a day spent expanding irrigation channels to the eastern fields, they returned to the house mud-splattered, but satisfied with their progress. The small shoots of corn were already pushing through soil that had seemed dead just weeks before. "Life returns," Bahi said, looking back at their work, "when given chance." Sarah understood he wasn't just speaking of plants. As twilight deepened into night, they sat side by side on the porch steps, shoulders almost touching, watching stars appear one by one in the vast desert sky. The scent of rain still lingered in the air, mingling with sage and the subtle spices Bahi used in the rabbit stew they'd shared for dinner. "In Boston," Sarah said quietly, "you can hardly see the stars. Too many lamps, too much smoke. How can people live without sky?" Bahi asked, genuine puzzlement in his voice. "They find other ways to feel alive. Theater, music, crowded streets full of strangers. And you? What makes you feel alive, Sarah Lancaster?" The question hung between them, simple yet profound. Sarah turned to look at him, finding his eyes already on her, reflecting starlight. "This," she whispered, "this land, this moment." Her courage gathered. "You?" Bahi's expression remained steady, but something in his eyes intensified. Slowly, giving her every chance to pull away, he reached for her hand. His palm was calloused from work, warm against her skin, as his fingers intertwined with hers. "Since my family died," he said, his voice low and measured, "I thought my heart was buried with them. But with you," he looked down at their joined hands, "it beats again, stronger than before." Sarah felt tears well in her eyes, not from sadness this time, but from the overwhelming realization that what was growing between them was real, not a replacement for what either had lost, but something entirely new, something neither had expected to find in the other. "I'm afraid," she admitted, "not of you, of this, of feeling again, of losing again. The Apache say that to truly live is to risk pain." His free hand rose to cup her cheek, his thumb gently brushing away a tear. "But without risk, there is no joy, no growth." In the silver light of stars and the quarter moon rising over distant mountains, Sarah looked into the eyes of this man who had walked into her life from the wilderness. This man who understood her silences, who saw beyond her careful facade to the woman beneath. This man whose own scars, visible and hidden, matched hers in depth if not in shape. "Stay," she whispered, "not just for the land, for me." Bahe's answer came not in words, but in the gentle pressure of his lips against her forehead. A benediction, a promise, a beginning. They remained on the porch long into the night, speaking softly of practical things and profound ones, hands joined, shoulders touching, the space between them finally bridged. And when a coyote called from the distant hills, its plaintive cry no longer seemed lonely to Sarah, but like a celebration of finding one's pack after too long alone. Tomorrow would bring new challenges: Morrison's threats, the town's judgment, the harsh realities of desert farming. But for tonight, in this moment of connection under the vast Arizona sky, Sarah Lancaster felt something she had thought forever lost. She felt home. The peace that Sarah and Bahi found in each other's company couldn't last forever. Reality intruded with the first light of dawn, as they knew it would. The morning after their quiet confession on the porch, Sarah awoke to the sound of hoofbeats approaching the ranch, too many for a casual visitor. She dressed quickly, her fingers fumbling with buttons as she moved to the window. 4 riders, dust rising behind them. She recognized Sheriff Boone's hat and Morrison's distinctive palomino. Bahi appeared at the door before she could call for him, his expression calm but alert. "I heard," he said simply. Their eyes met in silent communication, a language they'd developed over weeks of working side by side. In that glance was concern, resolve, and something deeper that neither had fully voiced yet. "They won't take kindly to what they suspect," Sarah said quietly, reaching for her father's old shotgun. Bae's hand gently covered hers on the weapon. "Let me speak to them first." "It's my land," she replied firmly. "My choice. We face them together." Something like pride flickered in his eyes as he nodded. Together. They knew their brief idyll was ending. The warning shot fired days ago had been only the beginning. Within a week, Sarah's repaired fences were cut again. One morning, they discovered 2 of her best chickens with their necks wrung. Another day, someone had dumped spoiled meat in her well. "They're trying to drive us out," Sarah said, her voice tight with anger as they worked to clean the contaminated water. Bahi looked at her, noting her use of us rather than me. He nodded. "Morrison fears what we build here, success he cannot claim." The harassment continued with increasing frequency, threatening notes nailed to fence posts, a dead coyote left on the porch, its throat slit. Each morning brought new evidence of nocturnal visitors bent on intimidation. Yet despite these attempts to break their spirits, their work continued to bear fruit, literally. The vegetable garden flourished under Bahi's care. The irrigation channels ensured their crops survived, even as other ranches withered in the summer heat. Bahi taught Sarah to identify edible desert plants, adding variety to their meals and reducing their dependence on town supplies. "The desert provides," he explained one evening, showing her how to prepare prickly pear fruit, "if you know how to ask." With each small victory, Sarah felt herself growing stronger, more certain. She no longer flinched at sudden noises or apologized for taking up space in her own home. She learned to track animals, to read weather patterns in cloud formations, to trust her instincts. And through it all, Bahi watched her with those perceptive eyes that seemed to understand her unspoken thoughts. The careful distance he had maintained at first gradually dissolved. Now his hand would linger on hers when passing tools. His smile, once rare, came more easily in her presence. At day's end, they often sat shoulder to shoulder on the porch, watching the sun paint the western sky in impossible colors. He began leaving small gifts for her to find, an intricately carved wooden bird, a wildflower placed beside her coffee cup, a smooth river stone with patterns like the night sky. Sarah kept each one, treasures that spoke volumes in their silence. Their evenings stretched longer, filled with stories exchanged in the lamplight. Bahi described Apache ceremonies, the wisdom of elders, the freedom of life before reservations confined his people. Sarah shared memories of Boston's cobblestone streets, her mother's garden, the books that had transported her to worlds beyond her sheltered upbringing. Neither mentioned the invisible line they had yet to cross, though awareness of it hummed between them like electricity before a storm. One sweltering afternoon, as dark clouds gathered on the horizon, promising the first real rain in months, Sheriff Boone rode up with 2 deputies. "Mrs. Lancaster," he called, not dismounting. "Need a word." Sarah set down her garden tools, wiping soil from her hands. Bahi appeared silently beside her, a protective presence at her shoulder. "Sheriff," she acknowledged, "what brings you out this way?" Boone's gaze flicked to Bahi, then back to her. "Had a complaint. Morrison says you've been diverting water from the creek. Says it's affecting his cattle operation." "The creek runs through my property," Sarah replied evenly. "We've simply ensured it doesn't go to waste. Also says his men spotted your worker here trespassing on his land." Bahi remained impassive, but Sarah felt him tense beside her. "That's a lie," she said firmly. "Mr. Bahi hasn't left this property except to hunt, and never in Morrison's direction." The sheriff's expression hardened. "Army's been asking questions too. Got reports of an Apache matching his description. One who escaped custody after killing soldiers." "Is there a warrant, Sheriff?" Sarah asked, her heart pounding despite her calm exterior. "Not yet," Boone admitted, "but it's coming. Thought I'd give you fair warning, being a decent Christian woman. You should send him away before you get caught up in trouble that's not yours." "Thank you for your concern," Sarah said coolly. "Is that all?" Boone studied her face, then Bahi's. "People are talking, Mrs. Lancaster, about the nature of your arrangement here." His eyes narrowed. "Your husband's been gone, 8 months now? Not proper for a widow to have a man living on her property, especially a savage." Sarah felt heat rise to her cheeks, not from shame, but from fury. "Mr. Bahe is employed as my ranch hand, Sheriff. What people choose to gossip about reflects on their character, not mine. Just looking out for your reputation, ma'am. My reputation is not your concern. Now, unless you have official business, I have work to do." After the lawmen departed, Sarah turned to Bahi, fear clutching at her throat. "You should go. They'll be back, and next time with a warrant." "And leave you to face Morrison alone?" His eyes flashed. "No. I won't have you arrested or worse because of me. It is my choice." He stepped closer, his voice low and intense. "Sarah, I stayed because of the land, yes, but I remain because of you." The admission hung between them, honest and vulnerable in the charged air. Behind them, thunder rumbled across the distant mountains. "What the sheriff said about the soldiers," Sarah began hesitantly. "I told you I killed 3 men who destroyed my family," Bahi replied, his gaze unflinching. "I do not deny this." Sarah nodded slowly. "I understand vengeance." It was not only vengeance. He looked toward the gathering storm. It was justice no court would give. The sky darkened rapidly as the storm approached. Fat raindrops began to fall, pattering against the dry earth, releasing the scent of creosote and renewal. "We should get inside," Sarah said, but neither moved. The rain intensified, soaking them within moments. Sarah tilted her face up, letting the cool water wash over her heated skin. When she looked at Bahe again, his eyes were fixed on her with an expression that made her heart stutter. "You are beautiful," he said simply, rainwater streaming down his face, plastering his shirt to the contours of his chest. "Like the first rain after drought." Sarah couldn't say who moved first, only that suddenly his hands were cradling her face, and hers were gripping his shoulders, and their lips met with the intensity of the storm raging around them. The kiss consumed her. Months of unspoken longing, of cautious glances and careful distance, dissolved in an instant of shared passion. His mouth was warm despite the cool rain, his touch reverent yet hungry. She felt the connection between them ignite into something fierce and undeniable. When they finally broke apart, both breathing heavily, Bahi rested his forehead against hers. "I have known since the moment you rode alone into Apache territory," he murmured. "My heart recognized yours." Sarah's fingers traced the scar on his cheek. "I was afraid to feel anything again, afraid it would break me if I lost someone else. The Apache believe fear and courage are brothers who live in the same lodge." His thumb brushed across her lower lip. "One cannot exist without the other." Lightning flashed overhead, illuminating his face in stark relief. The strong line of his jaw, the intensity of his gaze, the vulnerability beneath his strength. In that flash of clarity, Sarah recognized the truth that had been growing within her for weeks. "I love you," she whispered, the words both terrifying and liberating. "I didn't think I could again, but I do." Bahi's arms tightened around her. "And I you, Sarah Lancaster," more than words in any language can say. They made it to the house just as lightning cracked overhead, illuminating the world in brilliant white. Inside, dripping onto the wooden floor, they stood in the dim light, the air between them electric with possibility. Sarah reached for the top button of her sodden blouse, her eyes never leaving his. "Stay with me," she whispered. "Not as my worker, not as my protector, as my equal, as—" "Your heart," he finished, capturing her hand in his. "As you are mine." That night, as rain drummed against the roof and lightning painted shadows across the walls, Sarah and Bahi discovered each other with tender exploration and passionate abandon. His hands mapped her body with the same care he showed tending young plants. Her fingers traced the stories written in scars across his skin. Together, they created something new and sacred in the shelter of each other's arms. Afterward, lying in the tangle of sheets with her head on his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart, Sarah felt a peace she'd thought forever lost. "What will we do?" she asked quietly. "When they come back?" Bahi's fingers trailed through her hair. "We will stand, together." Outside, the storm raged on, but for the first time in years, neither of them felt alone in the darkness. Morning brought clarity with the washed clean air and vivid blue sky that follows desert storms. Sarah woke to find Bahi already awake, propped on one elbow, watching her with an expression of wonder. "I feared I dreamed you," he said softly, his hand gently tracing the curve of her shoulder. Sarah smiled, reaching up to touch his face. "No dream," she assured him, marveling at how natural it felt to wake beside him, as if her body had always known his. But reality couldn't be held at bay forever. As they dressed, their conversation turned to practical matters. "Morrison won't stop," Sarah said, pinning up her hair. "And now the army's involved." Bahi nodded, his expression grave. "We have choices to make." "We could leave," she suggested, though the words hurt to speak. "Start somewhere new." "And let them win?" Bahi shook his head. "This land is worth fighting for, as is what we build here." His eyes met hers. "But the choice must be yours too. I will not bring more danger to you." Sarah crossed to him, taking his hands in hers. "My choice was made the day I rode into the hills looking for you. I just didn't know it yet." Their fingers intertwined, wedding band against bare skin, a contrast that symbolized all they faced, all they risked. "Then we prepare," Bahi said, "and we do not show fear." The next weeks passed in a strange dichotomy. Days filled with vigilance and nights with tenderness. They reinforced doors and windows, created escape routes, stored supplies in hidden caches. But they also continued the work of making the land flourish, refusing to let fear dictate their lives. Their relationship deepened with each passing day. Sarah discovered the quiet humor behind Bahi's serious demeanor, the gentle soul beneath his warrior's exterior. Bahi marveled at her resilience, her ability to face adversity without surrendering her compassion. Each night, they shared not just their bodies, but their dreams, tentative at first, then with growing confidence. Perhaps when the harvests were good enough, they could buy more land. Perhaps in time the prejudice against their union would fade. Perhaps one day they might even have a family of their own. These whispered possibilities hung between them like the delicate strands of a spider's web. Beautiful, intricate, vulnerable to the slightest harsh wind. They knew such dreams were dangerous. Yet they clung to them, recognizing that hope itself was an act of defiance in a world determined to deny them a future together. One evening, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset, Bahi presented Sarah with a slender band woven from strands of horsehair and silver thread. "Among my people," he said quietly, "when two souls choose to walk the same path, they exchange tokens of their bond." Sarah's breath caught as he slipped the intricate band onto her finger where her wedding ring had once been. She had removed Thomas's ring weeks ago, storing it carefully in her keepsake box, not forgetting but acknowledging that her heart had found a new home. "It's beautiful," she whispered, turning her hand to watch the silver threads catch the dying light. "I have nothing to give you in return." Bahi's hand came to rest over her heart. "You already have." That night, their lovemaking held a new dimension, a sense of commitment, of futures entwined despite all obstacles. Sarah traced the lines of Bahi's face in the moonlight, memorizing every plane and angle, every expression that crossed his handsome features. "No matter what happens," she murmured, "this, us, is real, is worth everything." His eyes, luminous in the darkness, held hers. "Among my people, we say that true wealth is measured not in possessions but in connections, to the land, to each other, to the spirits that bind all living things." "Then we are rich indeed," Sarah replied, her heart full to bursting. Their peaceful moment was shattered by the sound of breaking glass. Bahe was on his feet instantly, reaching for the knife he kept near the bed. "Stay down," he ordered, moving silently to the window. Outside, orange light flickered against the barn wall. The acrid smell of smoke drifted through the broken window. "Fire!" Sarah gasped, scrambling for her clothes. They rushed outside to find the barn ablaze, flames already consuming the dry timber. Working together with desperate speed, they managed to free the horses and salvage some equipment. But the structure itself was beyond saving. As they stood watching it burn, Bahi's arm around Sarah's shoulders, hoofbeats approached from the direction of town. Sheriff Boone and his deputies rode into the yard, followed by Morrison and at least 10 of his men. "Tragic accident," Morrison called, his voice laced with false sympathy. "Lanterns and hay. Dangerous combination." "This was no accident," Sarah replied, fury making her voice shake. "And you know it." The sheriff dismounted, looking uncomfortable, but determined. "Mrs. Lancaster, step away from him. We've come to take the Apache in." Sarah felt Bahi's arm tighten protectively around her. "On what charges?" she demanded. "Murder of U.S. soldiers, trespassing, theft of cattle." Boone shifted his weight, hand resting on his pistol. "Army's offering a reward, dead or alive." "Convenient timing," Sarah replied, her mind racing, "just when my land is finally producing again." Morrison's false smile didn't reach his eyes. "Now, Mrs. Lancaster, this has nothing to do with your pitiful ranch. This is about justice, about civilization." He looked her up and down with contempt. "Your association with this Apache has shocked decent folks, but I'm a generous man. I'll still offer to buy your land, might even throw in train fare back east where a lady like yourself belongs. I belong exactly where I stand, Sarah said coldly. And I'll thank you to leave my property. Your husband would be ashamed, Morrison spat, his genial mask slipping. Consorting with a red devil, letting good Christian land go to waste. Sarah felt Bahi tense beside her, but squeeze her hand in restraint. Slowly, deliberately, she removed Thomas's wedding band from her pocket. She'd begun carrying it there since accepting Bahi's woven ring and held it up to catch the firelight. My husband believed in justice and hard work, she said clearly. Values Mr. Bahe embodies far more than you ever could, Mr. Morrison. She slipped the gold band back into her pocket. Now, I won't ask again. Leave my property. Morrison's face darkened with rage. Take him, he ordered his men. The woman too, if she interferes. As riders spurred their horses forward, Bahi pulled Sarah back toward the house. Inside, he urged. We prepared for this. They had indeed. Over the past weeks they had reinforced doors and windows, stockpiled supplies and created escape routes. Sarah grabbed her rifle while Bahi took position at a window. I won't let them take you, she vowed, checking her ammunition. Bahi's eyes held hers for a moment. Nor are you. The first shots came from Morrison's men, splintering wood around the windows. Sarah and Bahi returned fire selectively, aiming to wound rather than kill, to drive back rather than destroy. They'll try to flush us out, Bahi warned as gunfire intensified. Fire or smoke. As if summoned by his words, a flaming arrow arced through the air, landing on the roof. Another followed, then another. The back tunnel, Sarah said urgently. Now! They had dug a narrow passage from the root cellar, disguised by a false wall, leading to the creek bed. As smoke began to fill the house, they grabbed their prepared packs and retreated below. In the dim light of the cellar, Bahi pulled Sarah into a fierce embrace. Whatever happens, remember, you are the bravest woman I have ever known. And you, she whispered against his lips, are the man who taught me to live again. Their escape through the tunnel was harrowing. Tight spaces, the distant sound of pursuit, and the knowledge that discovery meant certain death for Bahe, and perhaps for her as well. But they emerged at the creek bed as planned, where two horses waited, hidden among the willows. Above them, black smoke billowed from the burning ranch house, the home Sarah had shared with Thomas, the place where she and Bahi had found each other. Tears stung her eyes, but she blinked them away, focusing on survival. South? Bahi asked, mounting his horse. Sarah hesitated, looking back at the destruction. Everything she had worked for, burning to ash. Then she looked at Bahe, his proud profile, his steady presence, his eyes that had always seen the truth of her soul. In that moment, she knew with absolute certainty that home was no longer a place. It was the connection they shared, the love they had built, despite every force aligned against them. Wherever you are, she said, reaching for his hand, that's where I belong. As they rode away from the flames, Sarah didn't look back again. Ahead lay uncertainty, danger, and hardship, but also possibility, freedom and love. The kind of love worth risking everything for, the kind that, like desert wildflowers after rain, could transform even the most barren landscape into something beautiful and alive. They rode through the night, the glow of the burning ranch fading behind them as they pushed deeper into the wilderness. Sarah's heart ached with each mile that separated them from the home she had fought so hard to preserve, but her resolve never wavered. Beside her, Bahi moved like a shadow through the darkness, his knowledge of the terrain guiding them safely away from pursuit. Dawn found them high in the foothills, where Bahi led them to a hidden canyon he knew from his youth. A small spring bubbled from rock, providing fresh water for themselves and their exhausted horses. Rest, he told Sarah, helping her dismount. Her body, unaccustomed to such prolonged riding, trembled with fatigue. We are safe for now. As Sarah drank from cupped hands, the reality of their situation settled over her like a heavy blanket. They were fugitives now, she by choice, Bahi by the cruelty of a justice system that had never recognized his humanity. What happens next? She asked, watching as Bahi expertly built a small, nearly smokeless fire. We have choices, he replied, his voice steady despite the circumstances. We can cross into Mexico. The border patrols are thin. Or we can try to reach the northern territories. Sarah studied his face in the growing light. the strong lines etched by sun and hardship, the quiet dignity that had first drawn her to him, the tenderness in his eyes when they met hers. "And if we stay?" she asked. "Fight for what's rightfully ours?" A ghost of a smile touched Bahi's lips. "Always the warrior," he said softly. "Even when the battle seems lost." "Is it lost?" Sarah moved closer, taking his hands in hers. "Morrison has wealth and influence, but he also has enemies. My cousin's husband works for the territorial governor in Santa Fe. If we could reach him, present our case." Bahi's expression grew serious. "The white man's law has never favored my people." "Then we'll make it favor truth," Sarah replied. "Morrison has bribed local officials, but he doesn't own everyone. If we can reach Santa Fe with evidence of Morrison's crimes, the falsified water rights, the intimidation, the arson, we might have a chance." "It is a dangerous gamble," Bahi warned, "for you as well as me." Sarah raised her chin. "Some things are worth fighting for." They rested through the day, planning their journey northward to Santa Fe. It would be risky, traveling through settled areas where Bahi's Apache heritage would draw immediate suspicion, where Sarah would be recognized as a woman who had defied convention. But the alternative, living forever as fugitives, always looking over their shoulders, was unthinkable. That night, as they lay together beneath a blanket of stars, Sarah traced the contours of Bahi's face with gentle fingers. "I've lost my home," she whispered. "But I haven't lost everything." Bahi caught her hand, pressing a kiss to her palm. "Home is not walls and roof," he replied. "My people understand this. Home is where spirit rests, where heart finds peace." His words resonated through her like truth itself. Sarah realized that while she mourned the ranch, what truly mattered had escaped the flames, their bond, their shared vision, their love that had grown against all odds. They knew their time of peace was limited. Within days they would need to begin their journey to Santa Fe, a distance of over 300 miles, through increasingly hostile territory. Search parties would be combing the area, and as news of their escape spread, vigilance would increase. "We should separate," Bahi suggested the next morning as they packed their meager supplies. "I draw too much attention. You could reach Santa Fe more easily alone." "No," Sarah said firmly. "We stay together. I won't have you hunted like an animal while I travel in safety." "Sarah." "No." She met his gaze without flinching. "Together, Bahi. Always." Their journey was fraught with peril. They traveled by night, hid during the day, and narrowly escaped search parties twice. Sarah's determination never wavered, nor did Bahi's protective vigilance. On the 8th night, as they camped in a secluded canyon, Bahi presented Sarah with a slender band woven from strands of horsehair and silver thread, more intricate than the first one he had given her, which had been lost in their hasty escape. "Among my people," he said quietly, "when two souls choose to walk the same path, they exchange tokens of their bond." Sarah's breath caught as he slipped the intricate band onto her finger where her wedding ring had once been. "I have nothing to give you in return," she whispered. Bahi's hand came to rest over her heart. "You already have." They reached Santa Fe 2 weeks after fleeing the ranch. Sarah's cousin's husband, Daniel Fletcher, was initially shocked by their appearance and story, but ultimately convinced by the documents Sarah had salvaged, Morrison's threatening letters, forged water rights claims, and her own detailed account of events. "It won't be easy," Fletcher warned them. "Morrison has friends in high places and," he glanced at Bahi, "prejudice runs deep." "So does the truth," Sarah replied. "And we have that on our side." The territorial governor, to his credit, listened. The investigation that followed revealed not only Morrison's harassment of Sarah, but a pattern of corruption that had allowed him to seize land from numerous smaller ranchers and, more damningly, to encroach illegally on reservation boundaries. As for the charges against Bahe, they were more complicated. The deaths of the soldiers were confirmed, but testimony from other Apache established that the attack on his village had been unprovoked, the result of a young lieutenant's ambition rather than military orders. 3 months later, Sarah and Bahi stood on a hill overlooking what remained of Whispering Creek Ranch. Morrison was facing prosecution, his empire crumbling, as those he had wronged came forward. The governor, recognizing the injustice Bahi had suffered, had granted him a rare pardon in exchange for his assistance, in establishing more peaceful relations with the remaining free Apache bands. "It will never be the same," Sarah said, surveying the blackened ruins of the house and the fields now overgrown with weeds. "No," Bahi agreed, his arm around her waist. "It will be different. Better." The land grant the governor had given them as compensation lay 50 miles north, a valley with year-round water and fertile soil, far from Morrison's former territory. Already word had spread that Sarah Lancaster and her Apache husband were looking for workers, offering fair wages and respect regardless of background. "You're sure about this?" Sarah asked, turning in Bahi's arms to face him. "Building something new together." His eyes, warm with love, held hers as his hand gently caressed her cheek. The Apache believed that true strength comes not from standing alone, but from roots that grow together, like the 3 sisters you planted. Sarah smiled, laying her hand over his heart. "Then let's plant new roots together." As they rode away from the ashes of the past toward the promise of their shared future, Sarah looked at the man beside her, the warrior who had taught her to fight, the healer who had mended her broken spirit, the man who had seen her tears when no one else noticed. In the golden light of sunset, his handsome profile was relaxed in a way she had never seen during those first tense weeks. The constant vigilance had softened into watchful contentment. When he caught her gaze, his smile, once so rare, came easily, lighting his eyes with a warmth that never failed to make her heart race. "What are you thinking?" he asked, guiding his horse closer to hers. "That some fires destroy," she replied, "but others transform, like desert plants that only seed after flames have passed." Bahe nodded, understanding as he always did. From the ashes, new life. 10 years later, Whispering Pines Ranch thrived in the northern valley. Orchards lined the slopes, fields of grain waved in the breeze, and a large home built of stone and timber stood at its heart. Children's laughter echoed across the yard, 2 dark-haired boys racing toward the barn, a young girl with her mother's eyes and her father's quiet dignity collecting eggs from the henhouse. Sarah stood on the porch, watching her family with a heart full to bursting. At 42, her beauty had matured like fine wine, the silver strands in her hair now a crown rather than an intrusion. Life had not been easy, prejudice died slowly, and there had been battles both legal and physical to secure their right to exist as a family. But with each challenge overcome, their bonds had only strengthened. Bahi appeared beside her, still moving with the silent grace that had first captured her attention. Time had added streaks of silver to his black hair and deepened the lines around his eyes, but had done nothing to diminish his strength or the intense love with which he regarded her. "The Wilsons have arrived," he said, nodding toward the approaching wagon, "and the Martinezes behind them." Sarah smiled. The monthly gathering had become a tradition, neighboring families coming together to share food, stories, and community. What had begun as a practical alliance for mutual protection had evolved into genuine friendship across boundaries of race and background. "Remember when people said it couldn't be done," Sarah mused, "that different cultures could never truly live in harmony?" "People fear what they do not understand," Bahi replied, his hand finding hers, "until someone shows them another way." Their eldest son, Thomas, named for Sarah's first husband in an acknowledgement that love could honor the past while embracing the future, ran to greet the arriving families. At 9, he moved with his father's grace, but possessed his mother's easy sociability, shifting effortlessly between English, Spanish, and Apache as he welcomed their guests. "He will be a bridge builder," Bahi observed with quiet pride. Their younger son, Kitua, more reserved at 7, stayed closer to the house, watching with intelligent eyes that missed nothing. Already he showed his father's affinity for plants, spending hours in the gardens and orchards, his small hands gentle with growing things. And then there was Lily, their unexpected blessing who had arrived when Sarah was nearly 40. At 2, she was a force of nature, fearless and determined, with her father's raven hair and her mother's stubborn chin. Sarah squeezed Bahi's hand, overwhelmed for a moment by the journey that had brought them here, from a desperate widow hiring an Apache stranger, to fugitives fighting for justice, to respected ranchers building a community based on mutual respect and shared purpose. "When I rode into the hills that day," she said softly, "I was looking for someone to save my land. I never imagined finding someone who would save my soul." Bahi turned to her, his expression serious. "You saved yourself, Sarah Lancaster. I merely walked beside you." And that made all the difference. As twilight settled over the valley, the gathering came alive with music, laughter, and the mingled aromas of different culinary traditions. Mexican dishes beside Apache preparation methods, Sarah's Boston baked beans next to sourdough bread from their German neighbors. Children played without regard for the differences adults found so divisive. Elders shared stories that preserved history while creating new understanding. Young couples, including some who had crossed racial lines inspired by Sarah and Bahi's example, danced to fiddle music beneath lantern light. Sarah found herself drawn into conversation with Elena Martinez, whose family had been among the first to accept work at the ranch, when others still whispered about the Apache's white woman. "Did you ever imagine this?" Elena asked, gesturing to the thriving community around them. "When you were fighting Morrison, running for your lives?" Sarah's gaze found Bahi across the yard, deep in conversation with John Wilson about irrigation techniques. Even after a decade, the sight of him still quickened her pulse. "I hoped," she replied honestly, "but hope is one thing. This—" She paused, taking in the scene. Diverse families breaking bread together, children playing games that blended traditions, land flourishing under shared stewardship. "This is beyond what I dared dream." Later, as the gathering wound down and guests departed with warm embraces and promises to return, Sarah and Bahi walked hand in hand through the orchard. Apple blossoms scented the night air, their pale petals luminous in the moonlight. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked him once. "Staying with me when you could have rejoined your people?" Bahi's fingers intertwined with hers, their wedding bands, his of silver, hers of woven horsehair replaced years ago with a more durable version, touching. "My people have a saying, 'Home is not a place, but the hearts that understand yours.'" He turned to face her, the love in his eyes as strong as the day they had stood against the world together. "You are my home, Sarah. You always will be." In the distance, their children's voices called them back to the house, Thomas reporting that Lily refused to go to bed, Kituwa asking for one more story before sleep, the everyday symphony of family life, once unimaginable to both of them in their separate sorrows. "We should go in," Sarah said, though she was reluctant to break the magic of the moment. "In a moment," Bahi replied, drawing her close. "First, this." His kiss, after all these years, still held the power to make the world fall away. His hands, still strong and sure, cradled her face with the same reverence he had shown that first rain-soaked day when they had finally acknowledged what was growing between them. When they parted, Sarah rested her forehead against his chest, listening to the steady beat of his heart. "Who would have thought," she murmured, "that when I hired an Apache to tend my land, he would end up tending to the tears no one else saw?" Bahi's arms tightened around her. "And who would have thought that a white widow would see past a warrior's scars to the wounded heart beneath?" They walked back to their home, hand in hand, toward the light spilling from windows and the voices of their children. Behind them, apple blossoms drifted like snow in the gentle night breeze, covering the ground with promises of future harvests, future joys. The path had not been easy. There had been losses, sacrifices, battles fought and sometimes lost. But as Sarah Lancaster and Bahe crossed the threshold of the home they had built together, both knew with absolute certainty that every step, every struggle, had been worth it. For they had found in each other not just love, but understanding, not just passion, but partnership, not just shelter, but true belonging. In a land where differences had once divided, they had created unity. In a time when prejudice had seemed insurmountable, they had proven that love could build bridges stronger than hate could tear down. And in each other's arms, night after night, year after year, they had discovered the greatest truth of all, that healing comes not from forgetting the past, but from creating a future worth living for. As they climbed the stairs to tuck their children into bed, Sarah caught Bahi's gaze in the soft lamplight. No words were needed. Their eyes spoke volumes as they had from the very beginning. "I see you," her look said. "And I you," his replied. Two worlds that had collided, transformed, and finally merged into something entirely new, something beautiful, something that would endure long after they were gone, living on in their children and in the community they had built together, a legacy of courage, of persistence, and above all, of love that refused to be denied. The story of Bahi and Sarah may be fiction, But it's a world I wish would one day become real, where no barriers exist between races, and love is genuine and there are never masks, superficialities and judgments from society, where love can always triumph. In their struggles and victories, we find not just a romance of the Old West, but a mirror for our own hopes. A reminder that authentic hearts, when they find each other, have the power to transform not only their own lives, but entire communities. May we, like them, have the courage to see beyond imposed differences, to stand up for what is just, and to build together a future where what matters is not the color of skin or origin, but the quality of character and the depth of love. For in the end, as Bahi and Sarah discovered, true home is not a place, but the hearts that understand yours. Thank you for staying with us until the end. We hope the love story of Sarah and Bahi warmed your heart and reminded you that real connection knows no barriers. If this narrative resonated with you, please like, share, and leave a comment telling us how it made you feel. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel and consider supporting us from the bottom of our hearts so we can keep creating meaningful stories filled with love, redemption, and emotional twists. At the end of this video, you'll see a suggestion for another one of our stories. Click and be surprised by more emotional journeys like this one.